The world is a desert. Are you looking for a deeper radicalization to go deeper down the rabbit hole, to the bottom of the rabbit hole? Are you looking for a more extreme polarization? Dictatorship of the proletariat. Gather unto me, sinners, I show you salvation. Dictatorship of the proletariat. This is episode 26 of World Solution Writing Process Podcast, in which you hear me free associate while trying to write the book that brings down global capitalism. All right. So, episode 26, part 9 of the Random Fragments series, where I just read my notes into a recording device while gathering my thoughts into clear writing to overthrow global capitalism with a book. So, I'm going to read my notes, my fragments. Got 9 pages in Word of them. I'm just going to dive into it. Here I go. Nonviolence chapter fragment. The real threat is neither socialists running for office, nor socialists starting riots or guerrilla war, but socialists taking on the methods of Martin Luther King Jr. Revolutionary dictatorship chapter. Who is the vanguard? Who possesses the truth? This is an existential question we all face. Our interpretation of who is vanguard depends upon our interpretation of what the truth even is. At the end of the day, it's always the dictatorship of our opinion versus the dictatorship of their opinion, such as life. None of this saves us from the fact that we who believe we possess the truth must appoint ourselves to power and be perceived as just as biased and power-hungry as anyone else while we do so, even if we do it for nobler reasons. Next fragment, West and the Rest. Ooh, this is juicy. The Ukrainian-Soviet War of the late 1910s and early 1920s was a blatant violation of the national autonomy the Bolsheviks had preached just a few years earlier, yet was deemed necessary, supposedly to keep reactionary Polish, German, and Austria-Hungarian troops out of Ukraine. But more realistically, because the infant Russian worker state needed Ukrainian grain to survive, and this was necessary for the entire global socialist project to remain possible. This was red imperialism, and it may have been necessary. This is especially evident given that the first phase of the Ukrainian-Soviet War was simply a Russian communist invasion. It was only in the later years that the conflict involved repelling Polish invasion. Poland, likewise, was invaded by the Soviet Union during the same time frame, for the pure imperial geopolitical reason that Poland was a connecting landmass to Europe, and Russia was looking to militarily assist socialist rebellions in Europe, specifically Germany, especially Germany. Again, this is red imperialism, socialist imperialism, for conceivably justifiable reasons. Are you beginning to realize you've been brainwashed with dogma, that even for all their historically central accomplishments, the Bolsheviks were often dishonest and hypocritical? And this legacy extends into the modern socialist movement today. Do you see that the real socialists practiced imperialism while simultaneously condemning it, and preached national autonomy while invading their neighbors? This is the tea. This is why I'm okay with, NATO backing Ukraine at this point. Sometimes it's empire versus empire, and you just pick the more progressive one, if one exists. Italics one, if one exists. Parallel government chapter fragment. The Ukrainian-Soviet War had several competing governments. How the movement grows over time. Movement building chapter fragment. Protesters and labor unions may be the frontline troops of a social movement, but theory, revolutionary organization, and parallel government are the heavy artillery. The regular troops are currently unable to advance further by their own strength. To break the stalemate, we need the heavy artillery. Another fragment for movement building, just 2 words, barn meetings. Time is running out, chapter fragment. The world is a desert, including the world of yet existing Marxist theory and revolutionary strategy. There's little reason to read anything but this book. Time is running out, fragment. Hopefully this book will have a spread and impact comparable in scale to Gene Sharp's From Dictatorship to Democracy, being used as a revolution manual in real revolts around the world. Change of government chapter. You may need to escort the principals. Principals is a term used for important persons placed under protection, though in this case they are also prisoners. If the legislature evacuates together, this gives us a temporary advantage, but they will still have to be located and either cut off from communications or apprehended and separated to prevent their conspiring to retake power, which they will almost certainly do. Next fragment, National Refoundation Chapter Fragment. The American people is an oppressed people, not mainly by a foreign power or some dictator, but by the economic oligarchy of the wealthy, in the form of private ownership of the means of production, and the political oligarchy of the wealthy, in the form of the capitalist Congress and the capitalist two-party system. Revolutionary Dictatorship Chapter Fragment. If the Continental Congress was all male, why would a socialist revolutionary legislature on American soil be any different? Later, I point out that United States Congress has its current record high of women participants at 28% women in United States Congress. That is not a Congress I'm trying to build, but instead the ruling capitalist United States Congress is only 28% women. But I'll get more into that later episodes. Next, parallel government. It would be absurd to expect a parallel legislature to meet in continuous session. Even ruling legislatures don't do that. Instead, the parallel legislature can meet on a regular, periodic basis, perhaps weekly or monthly, like an organization. It can meet in person nationally on some periodic basis if it is not organized locally, or it can have national meetings remotely. Movement Building Chapter Fragment. Underground and illegal organizing are intrinsically mysterious, cryptic, and shrouded in confusing miscommunication and silence, because the defining feature of such work is that you can't talk about it. If you are asked about it, you have to lie and deny that you are involved in it, or that it is even going on, often even to most of your own movement's fellow participants. It can only be communicated in situations involving highly secure electronic communications, though some topics may be so dangerous you should discuss them strictly in person, in environments free of devices, with phones placed in signal-blocking bags or containers, and removed to a distance. Even these conversations should only be held with people aware of such security measures, and you may have to explain the situation non-verbally, say by using a written note explaining these issues, so their initiation into knowledge of such measures cannot be overheard by state surveillance tapping their smartphones' microphones. A piece of paper with the following message could explain the situation silently. Do not read this message aloud, read it silently. Surveillance agencies listen to smartphone microphones, so some activists now follow practices to maintain privacy. Due to the omnipresent nature of surveillance, measures like this cannot always be explained. Sometimes, written notes can help clear things up. We may need to turn off phones, leave them at a distance, and place them in frequency blocking bags, which you can purchase online, or in some other frequency blocking object, some of which you have in your kitchen. Another practice involves going to other locations in favor of areas with fewer people and devices to have secure discussions. Combat Chapter Fragments. Small arms are those designed to be carried and fired by an individual. Rather than a separate sphere, violence is economic, since life and death are the most severe economics. Class and Identity Chapter Fragment. The Soviets had zero qualms enforcing their borders. Movement Building Chapter Fragment. The problem of many modern Leninists is that their answer to all political problems is to build a revolutionary organization, forgetting that the entire point of revolutionary organization is to build, support, and radicalize parallel governments. Class and Identity Chapter Fragment. We think of cities as leftist, but the majority of their populations has an ideology closer to a suburban moderate liberal than a woke leftist. Thus, we can carry out a more suburban politics in urban settings, as well as engaging edge cities and suburban organizing. National Refoundation Chapter Fragment. Especially in the United States, the entire Christian church should convert itself into a democratic socialist parallel government, especially more progressive denominations such as Quakers and Unitarians. Combat Chapter Fragment. A Ruger Mini 14 works like an AR-15 but looks way less intense. Class and Identity Chapter Fragment. A hack is an inelegant solution, and this is certainly such. Revolutionary Dictatorship Chapter Fragment. Could a rule of revolutionary patriarchy possibly be enforced explicitly? Perhaps it would also have to be enforced implicitly by recruiting in non-political male-dominated settings like metal shows or sports bars. Time is running out, Chapter Fragment. Writing this has been deeply uncomfortable. Writing an insurrection manual is a legal gray area. It seems you're in the clear unless someone uses it. Combat chapter. Fire without movement is a waste of ammo. Movement without fire is suicide. When traversing streets, move along the sides, and stay out of the middle. Perform fire and movement leapfrogging maneuvers across intersections. There's the individual movement technique. You can look individual movement techniques up on YouTube. A 3 to 5 second rush where you run forward for 3 to 5 seconds, then drop down on a prone position, prepare to fire, either cover or fire a few shots, then get back on up and keep running and do it again, drop down, fire, and people should be doing this in alternation with each other. Defense is achieved not solely through fortifications, but selective use of firepower, alternating between attack and retreat across the defensive area as the situation allows. In this sense, every defense utilizes the attack-retreat-reorganize cycle of guerrilla war. Defense is almost like fighting a guerrilla war inside your own base. Defense combines lanes of fire with physical obstacles to maximize the time the opposing side is forced to spend in the lanes of fire. To be clear, much of what I write is obvious, beginner-level military theory, and is really just meant to give absolute basics to total civilians who know literally nothing. In defense, the mental preparation of mentally organizing and categorizing the space into sections with associated battle plans is more important than physical walls. If possible, form a perimeter before entering a building. That's CQB, close quarter combat. Anyway, buildings eliminate the advantages of mechanized forces by creating a thick, impenetrable system of cover, similar in some ways to the jungle. However, this is only true if the opposing force is hesitant about demolishing cities. However, even a destroyed city provides a landscape of rubble, which is also conducive to guerrilla warfare. Fibua, or fighting in build-up areas, is the slower-moving British and Israeli method which engages threats as they appear. Moot, or mobile operations in urban terrain, is the American version focused on, quote, maximum penetration, God bless America, which is less focused on potential threats and more focused on quickly charging into each room and filling in the highest number of people possible into each room. Personally, I'm more of a Fibua guy than a Moot, but I'm not a professional. So, to quote The Expanse, it's the doors and corners that eat you. Move slowly through your doors and corners, Anyway, next. Marxism, main veins of Marxism, chapter fragment. An orientation toward labor is the main thing that social democracy and Leninism have in common. Strategy. Crowd revolution strategy. The ideology of revolutionary democratic socialism is itself a key component of the strategy. More on combat, house-to-house fighting. In the street, don't stand near any assisting vehicles on your side, because they might resist an explosion when they are hit, but you won't if you are standing near them. War is horrific devastation, but sometimes you have to process the depression in advance of admitting that revolutionary warfare is sometimes unavoidable. Rubble and civilian casualties are horrible. Killing and dying are horrible. After war junkie fantasies are pushed aside, what remains is the grim realism of admitting that sometimes war is unavoidable and you might end up in one. Ugh, hate it. This is why I'm such a grumpy cat. Anyway, movement building chapter. The key to conflict is realizing that when you are at your most exhausted and demoralized, the other side probably is as well. And if you can continue mustering even a reduced level of struggle, or even a minimal micro-struggle or micro-resistance, the other side may already be on the edge of collapse, needing only your gentle nudge. Combat fragment. House-to-house combat is about watching windows for opposition, fire and movement maneuvers around the outside of the building, and close-quarter battle tactics of stacking up and room-to-room fighting inside each building. Sometimes people divide up not only between, this is room-to-room combat, between left and right, but also high and low, because some opponents may be laying prone while others are standing up. It's also just a good general issue to remember. If you are assigned an area of responsibility, such as the corner of a room, then you could face opponents who are higher or lower in that corner, depending on whether they are standing or crouching, for example. Multi-party socialism. Rather than try to combine democracy and socialism by caving into social democratic reformism, we can combine the traditions of revolutionary democracy and revolutionary socialism. Movement building chapter. In any country, you often see alternation between high and low periods of protest activity. Sometimes the waves occur every few years, and some decades are relatively passive while others are more active. This is mostly due to the coordination problem of how mass movements are hard to begin, but then explode once in motion. A sort of bandwagon effect keeping movements either small or large with little middle ground. This is because when movements are small, most people see little point in participating. But when they are big, people dogpile and bandwagon into the movement. Class and Identity Chapter Fragment. A shift to the center is not only about popular acceptability, but also basic well-being. If the left represents change and dynamism, while the right represents stasis, every material organism needs a balance of these things, and too much of either is lethal. The cultural changes which the left wants to make are mostly positive, yet at the cultural level, too much change too fast can create social dysfunction, backlash, and collapse, which leads to a re-empowerment of both capitalist and right-wing forces. Main veins of Marxism. Trotskyism and democratic socialism are in some ways inadequate terms unto themselves, but also complement each other, each providing strengths while counterbalancing the other's weaknesses. Fascism. George Bush Sr. was in the CIA during the JFK assassination. Did old Bush kill JFK? If so, then he's part of the Republican cabal. It's possible that even the deep state Republican crypto-fascists are divided over Trump. Multi-party socialism. Far from irrelevant, the debate over the nature of the Soviet Union persists in being a central political question. This is partly because some Stalinist states do still exist, with China, Cuba, and Vietnam having shifted towards capitalism but still retaining a certain percentage of state-owned economy, as well as retaining ruling parties calling themselves communist. China stands for communist held in name alone, the socialist version of Rhino or Republican in name only. More importantly, the politics of the next revolutions and the structures of the next revolutionary governments have yet to be determined, making debates over past examples centrally relevant to envisioning the goal and thus being able to march toward it. Back to combat. Assault rifles can be prohibitively expensive for cash-strapped socialists like ourselves, meaning our small arms may have to be limited to pistols, rifles, and shotguns. If combat is limited, as we would hope, to the close combat range of a regime change operation, this is no problem. However, it's possible we may be halted, ambushed, or waylaid some moderate distance away from the main buildings, and thus be required to do some fighting in the street, such as in the minor final confrontation with security forces during Ukraine's 2014 revolution. This is often just a messy shootout in the presence of a protest crowd, half shootout and half riot. The main thing in this case is not to fire indiscriminately to avoid hitting your own fellow protesters. However, arms are an issue here. Mixed small arms may be the key. Parentheses. And the only thing your semi-organized rabble are likely to possess anyway. If you are up against regular police rather than special units such as SWAT, they are likely to be carrying only pistols, and therefore you'd be evenly matched. Be warned that security forces may combine live ammunition with riot control such as tear gas, like the US Marines did in the Battle of Hue in Vietnam. If the opposing force is military, they probably have rifles. There are a few ways of countering this. One is to use smoke grenades, fireworks, mobile barriers such as wheeled metal dumpsters, and classic fire and movement leapfrog tactics to advance to a range at which your pistols and shotguns are effective. Another is to include in your arsenal mixture a few non-automatic rifles, such as hunting rifles, so some people can provide effective covering fire at a range while others advance. Rifles can be cumbersome in room-to-room fighting, with the long barrels being difficult while passing through doorways, but no more so than shotguns, which often have a similar barrel length, and can be handled in the same manner and still be effective. The fights depicted in the last 20 minutes of the movie Lenin in October, in the telephone exchange and inside the Winter Palace, illustrate the sort of tense shootouts with a low number of shots fired, which can determine pivotal moments, but without automatic weapons, suitable to pistols and shotguns, and even hunting rifles. Alternately, you can bite the bullet and find cheap alternatives to the AR-15, such as the Ruger Mini-14. Any assault rifles on the civilian market will be non-automatic, but can be privately modified to be fully automatic. Parenthesis. Be advised, this is highly illegal, but also fairly common. End parenthesis. Redistribution. We can't have any guilt about redistribution. We have to literally read the ruling class the I drink your milkshake speech from There Will Be Blood. Revolutionary dictatorship. We must sometimes paradoxically fight for democracy by method of dictatorship and fight for equality by method of hierarchy. This is not our preference, but is compelled by material reality despite our preference. Time is running out. This entire book is deadpan comedy, that anyone would write about topics so obscure and intense in such a matter-of-fact tone as farcical. This is an implicit humor shared with the writings of Gene Sharp, though probably not intentional in his case. Revolutionary Dictatorship chapter. The problem is that leadership and dictatorship are often indistinguishable. Whose words and ideas get implemented? The leaders or the dictators? Same thing. Functionally, they have a significant overlap. Parallel government. People can use the more detailed measures from Robert's rules, but they are obligated to explain what such motions mean, and the majority is free to accept or reject any of the more advanced motions from being used as they wish, either incidentally for each motion or collectively for entire types of motions. Time. The mutual ruin of contending classes, quoting Communist Manifesto, is already occurring. Revolution is necessary to prevent further social disintegration. Movement building. We need a revolutionary socialist labor movement, and our work should revolve around building towards the emergence of just such a thing. Class and identity may move this to dictatorship. Revolutionary organizations are unavoidably masculine and dominated by majority male membership, at least in their decisive early stages. Combat. The problem with assassination, for example, is that it seeks to decapitate the hierarchy without acknowledging that a hierarchy is a pyramid with a sturdy social base. What needs to happen is overturning the entire social base of the pyramid from the bottom up through contagious non-cooperation. Removal of the very tip results in the tip being replaced and the pyramid remaining standing. Overturning the pyramid requires an organized and collective campaign beyond what any single action could ever achieve. West and the rest. Geopolitics. Western leftists ascribe magic powers to the Third World in terms of its ability to resist superpowers and greater, often Western-aligned military powers, but in practice that resistance was almost always supported materially by a rival superpower when successful. Time is running out. Intro chapter. In many ways, this book restates Lenin's assertion in Two Tactics of Social Democracy, the assertion that a revolutionary government must be formed even while the old government still stands, and his assertion in the April Theses that the revolutionary government must oppose the old government and fully take power. Certainly this book adds new assertions, such as the notion that a revolutionary government can and likely must be initiated by a small group in the modern context, as opposed to emerging, quote, organically or, quote, spontaneously out of a mass struggle for reforms or a mass protest wave. By locating the missing link in the modern understanding of the Russian Revolution, that of parallel government, this book helps people avoid the temptation and dead end/blind alley, to use the British term for dead end, of transplanting the Chinese Revolution's guerrilla warfare onto developed countries, which typically leads only to a very painful defeat for any who attempt it. Crowd revolution strategy. Since collapse is not revolution, the old system cannot be removed without a positive alternative being highly clear and visible. Why regime change? Quote, concreteness is often backward peer pressure. The movement can be doing very counterproductive or futile things, but if you're a, quote, concrete activist, unquote, you are obligated to participate because that is the state of the concrete struggle. All right, time to get a little conspiratorial. We're just about at the end here, people. Fascism chapter fragment. The best anti-fascist defense is a strong anti-capitalist offense. This only repeats Trotsky's assertions in Fascism, what it is and how to fight it. More on fascism. If the CIA is manipulating information, this means the American system differs from that of fascist Italy or Nazi Germany in that it does not wear its fascism openly and proudly on its chest, but instead hides its fascism behind an appearance of democracy, being better understood as crypto-fascism or disguised or secret fascism. This does not mean that America's crypto-fascism is as brutal or horrific as the open fascism of the Axis powers. It does mean we should be aware that not every bureaucrat in the American deep state has the same ideology of democracy that most Americans have, even though many of them do and are manipulated by their more cynical superiors. This inner fascist core in the American deep state may not be trying to reenact the Holocaust, but they don't believe in democracy and are willing to harm ordinary Americans and people of other countries on a large scale for cynical, non-humanitarian reasons. Of course, there are some inside the deep state who delude themselves into thinking they are serving democracy while violating it. But the torturous Montreal MK-Ultra experiments, under the supervision of Donald Ewan Cameron, who believed that humanity was divided into weak and strong and that the weak should be filtered out, proved that there are literal deep state fascists who believe that democracy is wrong. Rather than converting or persuading the fascist core, we will simply have to disintegrate their power by turning the rank and file of the people, the state bureaucracy, and the security forces against their superiors, like the rank and file revolt within S.H.I.E.L.D. against Hydra and Captain America Winter Soldier, to use a fictional example. But like all the other revolutions, off the top of my head, the Iranian Revolution of 1979 had these various rank and file revolts within the security forces. Anyway, that's the episode. Long enough, right? This has been World Solution Writing Process Podcast, episode 26, part 9 of the Random Fragments series. And that's all you're getting for a while. Someday, eventually, I'll come back to writing coherent episodes. But, of course, this is more about my writing process than your pleasure as a listener. So, someday I'll have a finished book, and I'll turn that book into an audiobook, and you can listen to that book. But that's not done yet. So for now, you get the process. Signing off.